We wake up, we rush to work, we pay the bills, and we wait for the weekend, only to start the cycle again. For many, this is life, predictable, safe, and exhausting. But Nietzsche would call it something else, a trap. A modern form of slavery where human beings trade their potential for routine, their creativity for security, and their individuality for the approval of the herd. What if life was never meant to be a treadmill of work and consumption? What if the rat race is not living at all, but merely surviving? Nietzsche forces us to confront this uncomfortable truth and challenges us to ask, is this the life I would choose to live for eternity? Nietzsche often warned against the dangers of what he called the herd mentality, a mode of existence where individuals surrender their own instincts, creativity, and inner compass in order to blend into the collective. When we look at modern society's rat race, the endless cycle of school, work, bills, and death, it becomes clear how deeply this herd instinct has taken root. Most people, Nietzsche would argue, do not live their own lives at all. Rather, they inherit a set of expectations, values, and routines handed down by society, and they follow them without question. To work 9 to 5, to strive for promotions, to buy houses and cars, to measure worth in terms of possessions or social approval, all of this becomes the unquestioned norm. It feels safe, it feels respectable, but for Nietzsche it is also the most profound form of mediocrity. The herd mentality is not merely about doing what others do. It is about internalizing society's rules so deeply that one forgets to ask whether those rules make sense for oneself. It is the quiet voice that whispers, "Do not stand out, do not take risks, do not disrupt the order." Nietzsche saw this conformity as a kind of spiritual suffocation, where the individual denies his or her own instincts and potential in order to avoid conflict or disapproval. In the rat race, people become interchangeable parts of a machine, driven less by their own desires than by what everyone else is doing. The tragedy is that this is not imposed by force but by habit and silent pressure. People convince themselves that this is life, that this is what being a good person, a responsible adult, requires. In reality, it is nothing more than the comfort of the herd, disguised as duty. For Nietzsche, the herd is always afraid of those who think differently, because such individuals expose the fragility of collective norms. In a world dominated by the rat race, someone who questions why life must revolve around labor and consumption is treated as lazy, dangerous, or unrealistic. The herd prefers safety and sameness. It distrusts those who refuse to play along. And yet Nietzsche would say that only those who step outside of the herd can truly create values of their own. Remaining in the herd means living according to second-hand values, being defined by the expectations of the masses rather than by one's own will to power. It means existing in a state of passive obedience, where one's highest achievements are simply fulfilling roles that society has already written. The herd mentality also explains why so many people tolerate the emptiness of the rat race without rebellion. Herd animals move together instinctively. No single member pauses to question the direction. In the same way, people accept the narrative that life is about education, work, retirement, and eventual death, without ever examining whether this narrative serves their deepest needs. Nietzsche would see this as a subtle form of nihilism, not the active rejection of life, but the passive acceptance of a life stripped of authentic meaning. By obeying the herd, individuals trade away their chance to define themselves for the illusion of belonging. This is why Nietzsche's critique feels so unsettling. He reminds us that most of what we consider normal is not chosen but inherited. The rat race is not the result of free individuals creating meaningful lives, but of countless people copying each other's footsteps, afraid to be left behind, afraid to stand alone. In this way, the herd mentality creates not only conformity but also a quiet despair. People sense the futility of endless work and consumption, yet they continue because everyone else does. Nietzsche's challenge is to recognize this pattern for what it is, not the natural state of life, but a form of mass submission that dulls the human spirit and chains it to mediocrity. Nietzsche's idea of slave morality provides a powerful lens through which to understand the modern rat race. At its core, slave morality is the morality of the weak, the powerless, and the oppressed, who transform their inability to assert themselves into a virtue. Instead of creating values from strength and vitality, they sanctify obedience, humility, and self-denial. In the ancient world, Nietzsche traced this to the rise of Judeo-Christian values, where suffering, meekness, and sacrifice were glorified. In the modern world, however, this same pattern has taken on new forms. The endless cycle of work, bill paying, and submission to external authorities is not simply a practical necessity, but a reflection of a deeper mindset. A mindset that accepts servitude as normal and even calls it good. In the workplace, slave morality is evident in the way people suppress their individuality for the sake of being seen as disciplined and responsible. The worker who gives up his creativity, his freedom, and even his health in exchange for a paycheck is praised as hardworking and virtuous. Society elevates obedience to the company, loyalty to the system, and sacrifice of personal desires as the highest forms of morality. To resist, to question, or to seek life outside of this structure is seen as selfish or reckless. Nietzsche would argue that this reversal of values is precisely the trick of slave morality. It turns weakness into a virtue and strength into a vice. Those who submit are honored. Those who rebel are condemned. The rat race thrives on this inversion, convincing individuals that their servitude is not only inevitable, but noble. Slave morality also reveals itself in how people cling to security over freedom. To live a truly free life requires risk, uncertainty, and the courage to defy conventions. But the morality of the slave insists that safety is the highest good. A steady job, a predictable income, a house, and retirement savings become the ultimate goals, not because they fulfill the soul, but because they protect against fear. Nietzsche would see this not as life-affirming, but life-denying. It reduces the human being to a cautious animal, afraid of stepping out of the pen even when the gate stands open. The rat race is sustained by this fear, by the deep conviction that survival within the system is more important than flourishing outside of it. The language of duty and sacrifice plays a central role in maintaining this morality. People are taught from childhood that life is about working hard, paying dues, and sacrificing joy today for security tomorrow. Parents, teachers, and employers all reinforce this narrative, praising conformity while discouraging exploration. Nietzsche would say that this is precisely how slave morality perpetuates itself, by instilling guilt and obligation in the individual. To resist the rat race feels wrong, not because it is inherently wrong, but because society has equated obedience with goodness. To quit a stable job in order to pursue art or adventure is framed as irresponsible. To continue in a soul-crushing routine is framed as admirable. This moral inversion ensures that people remain locked in patterns that ultimately serve external powers rather than their own, becoming, perhaps the most insidious aspect of slave morality is how it disguises dependence as virtue. Workers who dedicate their entire lives to serving corporations or institutions are celebrated as loyal and respectable. Yet this loyalty is not strength, but weakness. It reveals a lack of inner independence, a failure to create meaning on one's own terms. Nietzsche believed that true morality arises from strength, from the individual who creates values instead of submitting to them. But the rat race suppresses this possibility. It teaches people to value themselves only as useful instruments, to measure worth in terms of productivity and compliance. In doing so, it robs them of the chance to live authentically. Nietzsche's critique of slave morality exposes the rat race as more than an economic system. It is a moral framework that convinces people to celebrate their own chains. By glorifying sacrifice, obedience, and duty, it traps individuals in a cycle of servitude while convincing them that they are living rightly. It is not merely that people are forced to work, pay bills, and die. It is that they are taught to see this cycle as the proper, even noble, way of life. Nietzsche urges us to see this for what it is, not morality in the service of life, but morality in the service of control. Nietzsche believed that one of the greatest illusions human beings cling to is the promise of security. The structures of modern life, steady jobs, retirement plans, insurance policies, predictable routines, are all designed to give people the sense that life can be made safe, controllable, and certain. Yet beneath this polished surface lies a harsh truth. No amount of planning or routine can shield us from the fundamental chaos and unpredictability of existence. Death, suffering, and change are inescapable. By anchoring themselves so completely to the illusion of stability, people trade vitality and freedom for comfort and predictability. The rat race thrives on this bargain, convincing individuals that security is the highest good, while quietly draining them of the very energy that makes life worth living. For Nietzsche, the obsession with security is a symptom of a deeper fear of life. True life is uncertain, unstable, and always in flux. To live fully is to embrace this instability, to dance on the edge of the abyss without seeking permanent ground. But most people recoil from such a demand. They choose the apparent safety of repetitive labor, routine schedules, and well-defined roles because it allows them to avoid confronting life's raw unpredictability. The illusion of security thus becomes a shield against anxiety, but it is also a prison. By refusing to risk, people also refuse to grow. By avoiding danger, they avoid transformation. Nietzsche would say that this is not truly living, but merely existing in a diminished state. The modern economy thrives on this desire for stability. Corporations and governments present themselves as providers of safety, offering wages, benefits, and retirement in exchange for obedience. People accept this contract because it calms their fear of the unknown, but the cost is their independence. They become reliant on institutions for survival, and in doing so, they sacrifice the possibility of shaping their own destinies. Nietzsche would point out that such dependence is the mark of a slave mentality, not of a free spirit. To seek security at all costs is to place oneself in chains willingly, believing that the chain is protection rather than bondage. Even on the psychological level, the pursuit of security dulls human beings. Those who cling to routines, who spend decades in jobs they hate simply because they offer stability, often lose the spark of curiosity and creativity that defines a flourishing life. Nietzsche saw the will to power, the fundamental drive to expand, to overcome, to create, as the essence of human vitality. But this drive is stifled when people prioritize safety above all else. The will to power requires risk. It requires stepping into uncertainty to test and expand one's limits. Security, by contrast, demands submission and restraint. It tells individuals to stay within safe boundaries, to avoid the unknown, to suppress ambition in exchange for predictability. This pursuit of security also explains why so many people tolerate meaninglessness. Even when they feel the emptiness of the rat race, the fear of instability keeps them locked in place. They tell themselves that a paycheck is worth more than passion, that safety is more important than authenticity. Nietzsche would see this as a quiet form of nihilism. People continue living not because life is affirming, but because it is safe. They accept a half-life, convincing themselves it is enough, when in truth it is a denial of their deeper potential. The very things they cling to, routine, order, predictability, become the very things that suffocate their spirit. The illusion of security, then, is not simply a personal choice, but a collective illusion that shapes entire societies. Cultures organize themselves around stability, teaching their children to value safety over risk, conformity over individuality. This widespread desire for comfort becomes the invisible foundation of the rat race, keeping millions in quiet submission. Nietzsche would argue that only those willing to break free of this illusion can live authentically. But doing so requires immense courage. The courage to embrace uncertainty and to accept that life's meaning is not given by safety, but created in the face of danger. Nietzsche believed that one of the greatest tragedies of modern life is the way individuals willingly suppress their uniqueness in order to conform to social expectations. The rat race is perhaps the clearest example of this suppression. In a world where the value of a person is measured by their productivity, job title, or financial success, individuality is quietly eroded. People begin to define themselves not by their inner voice or creative impulses, but by the external standards of the marketplace and the approval of others. Nietzsche saw this as a profound betrayal of the self, because it means that the individual is no longer living according to their own will to power, but instead has become a cog in the machinery of mass conformity. The death of individuality does not happen overnight. It begins with small compromises, the decision to fit in at school, to pursue a career path that promises security rather than passion, to behave in ways that are deemed respectable rather than authentic. Over time, these choices accumulate until the person no longer remembers who they were outside of the roles society demanded of them. Nietzsche would describe this as a kind of spiritual amnesia, where the vibrant, unpredictable core of a human being is buried beneath layers of routine, duty, and social masks. The rat race thrives on this forgetting, because a person who has lost touch with their individuality will not question the system. They will simply continue running, chasing after the same shallow rewards as everyone else. For Nietzsche, the will to power is the essence of life itself, the drive to expand, to create, to shape the world according to one's own vision. But when individuality is suppressed, this drive is redirected into narrow channels defined by external forces. Instead of expressing themselves through creation, people channel their energy into competition, status-seeking, and obedience to authority. They pour their strength into climbing corporate ladders, gaining social approval, or accumulating possessions, all while their deeper potential lies dormant. The tragedy is not that they fail to achieve what society values, but that they succeed at it while never discovering what their own values might have been. The death of individuality also creates a kind of inner emptiness. Many people feel a vague sense of dissatisfaction even when they achieve the milestones society prescribes: graduating, working, marrying, buying a house, retiring. This dissatisfaction arises because these goals were never truly theirs in the first place. They are borrowed desires, second-hand ambitions handed down by culture. Nietzsche would call this a life lived in bad faith, a life where the individual deceives themselves into thinking they are choosing freely, when in fact they are merely obeying invisible rules. The result is a quiet despair, a nagging sense that something essential has been lost. This suppression is not accidental but reinforced at every level of society. Schools train children to follow instructions rather than to question. Workplaces reward obedience and punish defiance. Social norms stigmatize those who deviate too far from convention. Over time, people internalize these pressures so deeply that they police themselves, censoring their own thoughts and desires before anyone else needs to. Nietzsche saw this as one of the most dangerous aspects of the herd. It does not simply restrict behavior externally, but implants conformity into the very soul of the individual. The person becomes their own jailer, keeping their true self locked away for fear of rejection or failure. Nietzsche's challenge is to recognize how much of what we call identity is actually a mask designed to please others. The rat race thrives on these masks, rewarding those who wear them convincingly and punishing those who dare to remove them. To reclaim individuality requires immense courage, because it means defying the values of the herd and risking exclusion. Yet for Nietzsche, this is the only path to genuine life. Without individuality, without the courage to live according to one's own will, existence becomes little more than a shadow, a life lived for others rather than for oneself. Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, or overman, stands as the radical alternative to the monotonous treadmill of work, pay bills, and die. Where the rat race represents conformity, passivity, and submission to inherited values, the Übermensch symbolizes self-creation, freedom, and the active shaping of meaning. Nietzsche understood that life does not come with built-in purpose. Meaning is not handed down from gods, traditions, or systems. Instead, it must be created by individuals who have the courage to step beyond the herd and define existence on their own terms. The rat race denies this possibility by reducing life to survival within structures that already exist, while the Übermensch points to the possibility of transcending those structures altogether. For Nietzsche, the Übermensch is not simply a superior individual in the conventional sense, but someone who has overcome the illusions and comforts that trap most people. In a world where others accept work and consumption as the ultimate goals, the Übermensch refuses to measure life by external rewards. Instead, they see life itself as raw material for creation. Where the herd lives in fear of instability, the Übermensch embraces the uncertainty of existence as a space for invention. Where the herd clings to routine, the Übermensch experiments, takes risks, and asserts their will to power by shaping their life like a work of art. This does not mean recklessness for its own sake, but a deliberate act of saying yes to life in its fullness, even its hardships. The rat race encourages people to live as if life were a checklist of obligations: study, work, save, retire, die. Nietzsche would see this as a life of passive nihilism, a life where one drifts along paths already paved by others. The Übermensch, in contrast, recognizes that such paths are illusions. There is no preordained way to live. There is only the opportunity to create. This act of creation is not limited to art or philosophy, but applies to every choice a person makes. To live as the Übermensch is to craft one's values, to define success according to one's own measure, and to live in such a way that each day affirms life rather than merely enduring it. A central feature of the Übermensch is the courage to destroy as well as to create. Nietzsche knew that breaking free from the rat race requires dismantling the inherited beliefs that keep people trapped. Ideas of duty, humility, and conformity must be questioned and often discarded. The Übermensch is willing to destroy the false idols of society, whether religious, economic, or cultural, in order to clear space for new values. This destruction is not nihilism in the negative sense, but a necessary step toward affirmation. By rejecting second-hand values, the Übermensch makes room for authentic ones. Nietzsche also tied the idea of the Übermensch to joy and affirmation. To live as the Übermensch is not to retreat into bitterness or constant rebellion, but to affirm life even with its suffering. Where the herd seeks to minimize pain through security and routine, the Übermensch accepts suffering as part of the creative process. Pain is not something to be avoided at all costs, but something to be transformed into strength. This transformation requires an active stance toward life, a willingness to face reality without illusions, and the strength to shape it into something meaningful. In this way, the Übermensch serves as a direct answer to the despair of the rat race. If endless work and consumption drain life of meaning, then the solution is not to escape into fantasy, but to rise above the very system that demands conformity. The Übermensch demonstrates that freedom is not given but taken, that meaning is not discovered but created. Nietzsche presents this figure not as a distant ideal, but as a challenge, to reject the path of passive obedience and to take up the task of becoming the creator of one's own existence. Nietzsche's thought experiment of eternal recurrence is one of his most provocative challenges, and when applied to the context of the rat race, it exposes just how hollow and repetitive that cycle truly is. The idea is simple yet devastating. Imagine that a demon tells you that you must live your entire life over again, in the exact same sequence, down to every detail, for all eternity. Every joy, every sorrow, every small routine, and every major event would repeat endlessly without alteration. How would you respond? For Nietzsche, this question is not about metaphysics but about testing the strength of one's relationship to life. If you recoil in horror at the idea, it means that your life is not being lived in a way worth affirming. If you could embrace it joyfully, it would mean that you have achieved a life that is truly your own, one that you would willingly choose again and again. When this challenge is applied to the life of the rat race, the results are unsettling. To imagine living the same endless cycle of waking to an alarm, rushing to work, paying bills, sitting in traffic, and waiting for weekends only to repeat the pattern forever is almost unbearable. For many people, the thought of repeating their current existence eternally would feel like a curse, not a blessing. Nietzsche uses this thought experiment to force us to confront a difficult truth. If the idea of eternal recurrence fills us with dread, then perhaps we are not truly living but merely enduring. The rat race, with its emphasis on routine and obligation, fails the test of eternal affirmation because it is not chosen out of love for life, but tolerated out of fear and habit. The eternal recurrence strips away illusions. People often tell themselves that the suffering and boredom of today will be justified by some future reward, a promotion, retirement, or the vague hope of happiness later on. But under eternal recurrence, there is no later that redeems the present, because the present is endlessly repeated. There is no escape from the life one is currently living. This removes the possibility of comfort through postponement and forces the question, is this life worth living if it had to be lived again forever? For Nietzsche, this is the ultimate measure of authenticity, because it demands that every moment be embraced for its own sake, not as a means to some distant end. In the context of the rat race, eternal recurrence reveals how deeply people deceive themselves. They endure long hours at jobs they dislike, believing it will all be worthwhile in the future, yet they never ask whether the present itself has value. If one must relive this present forever, then every compromise, every wasted day, every moment of submission becomes eternal. Nietzsche's challenge is ruthless because it leaves no room for excuses. The way one lives today is the way one would live for eternity. If that thought inspires despair, it is a sign that life is being lived against oneself rather than in affirmation of one's deepest potential. But eternal recurrence is not meant to paralyze with despair. It is meant to awaken. It is a call to live differently, to construct a life that one would gladly embrace eternally. In rejecting the rat race, Nietzsche does not offer easy alternatives. But he insists that individuals can create values and purposes that make life worth repeating. Instead of existing as a cog in a machine, one can shape a life filled with meaning, creativity, and joy, a life that would pass the test of eternal recurrence. The question then becomes not how to survive the rat race, but how to live in such a way that one could look at existence itself and say, with full conviction, yes, I would choose this again and again. The rat race promises security, respectability, and a sense of belonging, but Nietzsche unmasks it as a quiet form of slavery, a cycle that drains individuality, glorifies obedience, and disguises fear as virtue. He forces us to ask the hardest question. If we had to live this life again and again for eternity, would we embrace it, or would it feel like a curse? For most, the thought of repeating work, bills, and endless routine exposes the emptiness of this existence. But Nietzsche does not leave us in despair. He points instead toward the courage to break free, to create meaning rather than inherit it, to live not as a cog in the herd, but as an individual who shapes life into art. The challenge is not merely to escape the rat race, but to transform existence into something so affirming, so deeply one's own, that even eternal recurrence would feel like a blessing. The choice ultimately is ours, to submit to the cycle of survival, or to rise above it and live a life worth saying yes to forever.